I'm typing this in a borrowed notebook app, on a phone that's nearly out of battery. I don't even know who I hope will read this, but I need to leave behind some testament of what happened to me. If you ever come across my story, believe that these events unfolded exactly as I described them. I'm no fantasist or writer, just someone whose life took a terrible turn one Friday night after leaving my favorite bar. People say I went missing. In a way, they're right, but it's more complicated than that. It all started on an otherwise ordinary Friday. The end of the work week brought me a surge of relief, like finally peeling away from a week of stress, and the simplest way to unwind was to walk over to the Raven's Nest. It was a bar I'd been frequenting for years, comfortable in its dimness and reliably low on drama. Located on a quieter side street, the Raven's Nest never drew the loudest crowds or the rowdiest parties, and that suited me. I'd tuck into a shadowy corner, order a whiskey sour, and let the background hum of laughter and conversation separate me from any worries about deadlines or commute hassles. The place itself was easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. A small neon raven perched above the door, wings half spread, glowing in subdued red and purple. Inside, the lighting always struck me as nearly theatrical. Soft bulbs recessed in the walls, overhead pendants faintly tinted amber, enough to reveal faces, but not details. You had to step in close to recognize someone, which was perfect if you wanted to blend into your own thoughts. That Friday, I arrived around 10 and nodded at the bartender, who barely needed to ask what I wanted. She made my usual drink, whiskey sour with an extra dash of bitters, while I took my regular seat at the far end of the bar, near a wall where I could rest my back and watch the comings and goings. At that hour, the place was already humming. Groups of friends occupying the tables, a few couples on dates whispering to each other, and a handful of folks like me content with solitude. I sipped my drink slowly, letting the acrid tang of whiskey and lemon wash away any leftover tension from work. Time moved strangely in the Raven's Nest. I remember glancing at my phone, noting it was nearly midnight and feeling only mild surprise that 2 hours had slipped by so quickly. That was part of its charm. You could lose yourself in the ambient murmur, the faint blues music that sometimes played, and the unhurried pace of people unwinding. By 1 in the morning, the bar had started to empty. A boisterous group of college students settled their tab and departed in a burst of rowdy laughter. An older couple followed a few minutes later, stepping out onto the street arm in arm. Eventually, only a few clusters of patrons remained. 2 men absorbed in a game of darts near the back, a woman with a paperback novel at a corner table, and me with my whiskey sour. I checked my phone again at around 1:30. My second whiskey sour was nearly finished, and I realized I ought to head home if I wanted any decent rest. The city had decent public transit, but my apartment wasn't far, so I usually walked. The bartender flashed me a friendly smile as I paid my tab. I returned the smile, pulled on my jacket, and slipped out the door, fully expecting the usual quiet walk home under the same streetlights and the same old storefronts. I had done this so many times before. There was no reason to anticipate anything different. When I emerged onto the sidewalk, the air was cool, and a hush had settled over the city. Occasionally on a Friday night, you'd still hear voices or see a group stumbling out of another bar. But that night, the street seemed empty. The few shops on the block had their shutters down, windows dark, and the only real light came from the street lamps. I remember thinking I must have missed the nighttime stragglers by a few minutes. I shrugged it off, hands in my pockets, heading for the main avenue where I could turn right to my apartment. Not far from the bar, I saw a man standing beneath one of the street lamps. He wore a long dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that hid much of his face. His posture suggested he was watching me, though I couldn't see his eyes clearly. Thinking maybe he was just another night owl or someone waiting for a ride, I kept walking, but I glanced over my shoulder after a few moments and found him gone. He had melted away from the lamp's halo of light as though he hadn't been there at all. That unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Still, the city is full of odd characters, and I tried not to dwell on it. Yet as I continued, I couldn't shake a sense of unease. The quietness felt heavier than usual, and the emptiness of the street seemed unnatural. I quickened my steps, hoping my imagination was simply overactive. Near the next intersection, I decided to cut through a side street that would save me a couple of blocks. This route led between older buildings, their bricks stained by decades of grime and soot. Streetlights were sparse, and every footstep echoed strangely. I reminded myself I'd traveled this path many times before without incident. About halfway down the side street, I heard footsteps behind me. They matched my pace exactly. Whenever I slowed, they slowed. Whenever I sped up, they followed suit. A jolt of worry hit me. I stopped and turned, expecting to see someone just a few yards away, but the alley behind me was empty. No movement except the faint flicker of a distant lamp post. I frowned, my mind spinning with rationalizations. Maybe the sound was an echo, but something felt off. I walked on, the footsteps returning, faster now, as if the person behind me had grown bolder. In a surge of anxiety, I took a sharp turn into an even narrower alley, hoping to lose whoever might be trailing me. That alley wound between tall brick walls, the passage lit only by a single overhead light. I followed its twists until I emerged in a small courtyard I didn't recognize. The space was enclosed on three sides by old buildings with boarded windows, and a locked iron gate blocked the fourth side. A solitary light fixture flickered, revealing little more than cracked pavement and piles of discarded boxes. At that moment, I realized the footsteps had ceased. Nothing but the buzzing of the flickering bulb overhead. My breath felt ragged, so I stood there, scanning the shadows for any sign of the man I'd seen under the street lamp. The courtyard looked utterly deserted, but my disquiet didn't ease. I noticed a building with a faint glow inside, a door slightly ajar as if inviting me in. Perhaps I hoped it was an inhabited place, a caretaker's office, or maybe a tenement with late-night dwellers. In any case, the chance of refuge or friendly faces compelled me to approach. I stepped inside. The door led to a hallway thick with the smell of dust and time. Yellowed wallpaper peeled away from the walls in long strips, and the overhead fixtures emitted weak, sporadic light that left entire stretches of the corridor in darkness. Doors on either side were closed. Some looked nailed or boarded over. As I moved forward, I tried calling out a greeting, but no voice answered. It was as though the building itself was forsaken. Yet the further I ventured, the more I became aware of some presence lurking just out of sight, like the walls themselves held their breath, waiting. At the end of the corridor, an open doorway revealed a small foyer. A battered staircase led up, but many of its steps were missing or broken. Another narrower flight of stairs disappeared downward. I heard a distant drip of water, or maybe it was a scraping sound. It was the only noise that suggested activity. Against all logic, I turned toward the steps that led down. My rational mind scolded me for diving deeper into this mysterious structure, but I felt an odd sense that my pursuer might still be behind me, and going down seemed the only path that offered answers or escape. The air below was colder. tasting of damp concrete and stale decay. The basement had old shelves along the walls, sagging under the weight of dust-covered boxes. Light came from a single bulb that did little more than emphasize the darkness creeping in around it. I moved slowly, scanning for a phone, a fuse box, or any sign of an occupant. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a whisper. Not a normal voice, but a soft, indistinct murmuring, like someone muttering just beyond my field of vision. I called out, but silence returned. The only response was the echo of my own voice. Pressing on, I discovered footprints in the dust on the floor, fresh ones that weren't mine. They led around a corner to a dimly lit chamber. As I approached, the whispering swelled again, and my pulse hammered in my ears. It felt as if the building had grown smaller, each corridor funneling me deeper. When I peered into that chamber, I caught sight of a figure standing in the far corner. Though the light was faint, I could recognize the wide-brimmed hat, the dark coat, the same silhouette from outside. He watched me with an unreadable stillness. My first instinct was to back away, to find the stairs and run. But a sense of dread pinned me where I stood. Without speaking, he raised an arm and pointed to another door, a battered piece of wood half off its hinges, leading to yet another area. Something in me understood that if I tried to sprint back the way I came, he would block me effortlessly. It was as if this entire place belonged to him, or answered to his will. Summoning whatever courage I had, I skirted around him, my steps shaky on the uneven floor, and slipped through that next door. On the other side lay a corridor carved out of older stone, sloping downward. The walls dripped with some kind of moisture. A foul odor lingered in the air, like something rotten or ancient. Low-mounted sconces glowed faintly, casting shifting shadows across the narrow passage. My sense of direction collapsed. I had no idea how many levels below ground I was. Time no longer felt linear. Minutes turned into unknown intervals. The building above seemed worlds away. Yet I pressed on, hoping to find an exit. Eventually, the corridor opened onto a small room where a solitary candle flickered on the floor. The walls were carved with strange symbols I'd never seen before. Spirals, geometric lines, and shapes that might have been letters or runes. It looked like an abandoned ritual site. In the center stood a tall mirror, its frame made of some tarnished metal etched with bizarre patterns. The mirror's surface was dark, offering no reflection at first. I stood there, transfixed by the hush of the space. A whisper came again, layering over itself until it almost formed words, though none I recognized. Then I sensed the presence of the man behind me, though I hadn't heard him enter. He remained half in shadow, his eyes reflecting a faint gleam. I turned to face the mirror, and gradually an image formed. My own reflection, but twisted. My features looked off, as if elongated. The reflection's eyes were dull. A creeping dread took hold. The feeling that the mirror was showing me a fate rather than a simple reflection. The man spoke in a voice that seemed to emanate from all around the room, not just his mouth. He told me I had wandered into a place I never should have found, that some paths at night lead to domains where unknown forces can claim wanderers. I wanted to shout, to demand answers, but my voice felt locked in my throat. The reflection in the mirror shifted further, features warping into something unrecognizable, something that wore my shape, but wasn't me. There was a moment of distortion, as if reality itself rippled. The candlelight wavered, the air changed. I lost my footing and everything went black. I woke up, if it can be called waking, in a different section of the basement, lying on cold concrete. Hours must have passed. My phone, when I checked it, showed the earliest hint of morning outside, but the building around me remained in deep gloom. No sign of the man, nor the mirror, nor even that corridor. I stumbled around, eventually finding a set of stairs that led back to the first floor. The building's layout had shifted. That main corridor with all the doors was gone, replaced by a shorter hallway leading straight out to the courtyard. When I exited into the courtyard, dawn painted the sky in pale gray, the entire city beginning to stir. With unsteady legs, I found my way to a more familiar street. Eventually, I reached my apartment block. From the outside, everything looked normal, but as I climbed the stairs to my floor, I felt a strange sense of alienation. My key still fit the door, but when I cautiously entered, I discovered items on the kitchen counter I didn't remember buying, papers I didn't recall signing. The atmosphere felt lived in, as though I had been present the entire night. A neighbor across the hall greeted me with a casual, "Hey, you're up early," as if we'd spoken recently. Over the next day, confusion set in more deeply. My coworkers acted as though they'd seen me at the office the previous afternoon. Friends sent me texts referencing conversations I never had. My parents claimed I'd given them a call late at night to say I was fine. Yet I had no memory of any of this. When I tried to explain my bizarre experience, people responded with polite concern or teased me for joking around. It was as though a duplicate version of me had been living my life while I floundered in that labyrinthine building. In the days that followed, any attempt to relocate that courtyard or the alley led nowhere. The route I'd taken seemed to shift or vanish. Even the Raven's Nest felt different. The bartender recognized me, calling me by name, joking that I'd been in just the other night. According to her, I'd shown up around closing time, told a couple of jokes, then left with a casual wave. But I knew I hadn't stepped foot inside since my disappearance. Something else was going in my stead. My frustration grew. More than that, a pervasive sense of displacement took hold. I existed on the fringes of a life that was still moving on. My finances, my social connections, and even my job continued as if I'd never gone missing. Yet I was keenly aware that my recollections of the last few nights simply didn't match. Every once in a while, I thought I glimpsed a figure in a wide-brimmed hat at the end of a street. But the moment I tried to confirm it, the silhouette vanished. Sometimes I saw him on the sidewalk across from my apartment, as though verifying that his plan, or his substitution, remained undisturbed. I tried explaining everything to the police, but there was no crime in their eyes. My own statements contradicted every piece of evidence. No official record placed me as missing. No coworker or family member believed I had been gone longer than an evening. They might have thought I was under some stress or experiencing confusion. I found no help there. Poring through local archives, I found scraps of urban legends. Rumors about a man in a wide-brimmed hat who appeared at crossroads. Tales of people who took the wrong side street late at night and were never the same again. None of it was conclusive. I had no solution for reclaiming my identity from the doppelganger living it. It was as though I had inadvertently stepped into a myth. I started sleeping on friends' couches, pretending I had a water leak in my apartment, until they pointed out I'd been back in my place at odd hours, or sending them texts that sounded exactly like me. So I packed a small suitcase and checked into a cheap motel. Even then, I worried that the other me was wandering around town, shaping conversations I'd have to pretend I remembered. Every attempt to find that old building with the basement ended in frustration. Streets didn't match my memory, or the courtyard I recalled would be replaced by a loading dock. People I asked had never heard of such a building or recognized any local rumor about a hidden underground labyrinth. The city itself seemed to keep shifting, or perhaps my sense of direction had been irreparably warped. Occasionally, in the middle of the night, I revisit the Raven's Nest. I stand outside across the street, half hidden in an alcove. I peer through the window, and sometimes I see someone who looks like me chatting with the bartender, sipping the same whiskey sour I always ordered. He departs near closing time, giving a polite nod to those around him. Nobody suspects he's anything but me. Meanwhile, I remain an onlooker to my own life. I write these words in the hope that the next person who stumbles across a deserted street or a hidden courtyard, or hears faint whispers in a locked basement, will think twice before forging ahead. Because I truly believe that once you breach that threshold, once you let that man in the wide-brimmed hat single you out, something else might take your place. You'll vanish from your own life, but nobody will realize, because you'll still be visible to the world in another form. Only you'll know the truth, and by then it'll be too late to reclaim the life you had. Whoever finds this account, be cautious. If you're walking home late and the city feels unnaturally silent, if you sense a silhouette watching under a flickering street lamp, change your route. Head to a brightly lit area, find a group of people, hail a cab, do anything but keep going deeper into the darkness. If you see a door open in a place where no door should be, resist the lure. The alternative might be what happened to me. To become an observer in your own world, displaced by an entity that steps seamlessly into your shoes. I can't tell you how to fight it, because I haven't succeeded. All I can offer is a warning. I exist now in this strange half-state, drifting from one borrowed room to the next, watching from the periphery as I go about daily routines. My phone's battery rarely holds a charge, and once it dies, I'll lose this last means of logging my experiences. If I vanish entirely, if the man with the wide-brimmed hat finds me again, I may well fade into some deeper darkness, the one he first lured me to. Perhaps my final note here will serve as a cautionary tale or proof for anyone else who senses they've encountered a similar phenomenon. That's all I can do. Bear witness. If you stumbled onto this lengthy confession, please believe me. I left the bar one night and walked into a labyrinth of old bricks, half-lit corridors, and a presence that stole my place. My old life goes on, outwardly unchanged, while I remain stuck outside it, a phantom to everyone who once knew me. So if you see a tall stranger at night, wearing a coat and a wide-brimmed hat, and you feel a hint of unnatural silence on the streets, choose another road home. Once you look into that reflection, or that labyrinth, there may be no coming back, no matter how desperately you want to reclaim what was yours.